And again, we'll have 15 minutes to present, 7 minutes reserved for Q&A discussion. If there's not very much Q&A and discussion, I can give you a few more minutes to discuss anything you didn't get to in your presentation. And then we'll just move to the next presentation once the total of 22 minutes is over. We'll go on the order of the program. So I'm going to get started now. Well, the bar is, the bar seemed to go away to start the session. Did it automatically start? ASSA support? Okay, so the session automatically started. So thank you everyone who is here joining us this morning for this session on the many faces of racial stratification. I'm your session host, Robynn Cox. And today we have with us Travis Campbell, who will be presenting on Black Lives Matter's effect on police lethal use of force. Myself, Robynn Cox again, I will be presenting on the impact of intergovernmental transfers on racial disparities and incarceration, and this is joint work with Jamein and Cunningham. We will then have Janna Johnson, Samuel Myers, Gregory Price, and William Sabol presenting on modeling of racial disparities in female incarceration rates. Stephen McMullen will be presenting on can baby bonds address historic racial injustice? And then finally, we will have Hanna Szymborska presenting on patterns of wealth accumulation, inequality, at the intersection of gender and race for the case of the USA. And so we will go in the order of the program. Each presenter will have 15 minutes to present. I will keep time, and then we'll reserve 7 minutes after their presentation for Q&A and discussion, or if the presenters have a few more things that they didn't get to during their presentation, then they'll have an opportunity to sort of do that at that point. Once everyone has presented, we will still have a few minutes remaining for open Q&A for the session where you can ask any questions for any of the papers. If you could put your questions, you can submit your questions to the chat, and I can read them to the presenters for them to answer. So without further ado, let's get started. First up, we have Travis Campbell.
Hello, can everyone hear me and see my screen? All right. So my name is Travis Campbell. I'm a graduate student at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and I'm here to present my paper, Black Lives Matter's Effect on Police Lethal Use of Force. I'm very excited to hear your comments. I'm going to try and move pretty quickly. So the question is straightforward and from the title: has Black Lives Matter reduced lethal use of force by police? I think this question is incredibly interesting for a variety of reasons. First and foremost, this is an explicit goal of the Black Lives Matter movement. And also because the sign of the impact is uncertain a priori, because the protests may not have any effect. They could work and reduce lethal use of force, but they may actually increase lethal use of force by the police if they, for instance, increase violent crime in the city or increase police hostility for whatever reason. There's two main obstacles to answering this question. First, I have to rely on media-based data for both police lethal use of force and also Black Lives Matter protests, which has implicit population-driven measurement error from the media underreporting in places with less population. Second, it has been shown, unsurprisingly, that lethal use of force predicts future Black Lives Matter protests. And since lethal use of force is relatively rare, this could create substantive difference in the police homicide trends between places with and without protests prior to the protests occurring, which contradicts a difference in difference assumption. Nonetheless, I'm going to use a stack difference and difference design to try to answer this question, and I will hopefully convince you all that I deal with these two issues adequately. So first and foremost, what is Black Lives Matter? So Black Lives Matter actually began as an online protest in response to the acquittal of George Zimmerman for the killing of Trayvon Martin. Black Lives Matter didn't grow into the global in-person protest movement we think of it as today until 2014, after the police killed Michael Brown and the subsequent insurrection in Ferguson. So the protests tend to cluster in places with high profile police killings, which typically involve a white officer killing a Black male, which is caught on video and the victim is unarmed. And as Black Lives Matter has matured as a movement, the demand has also increased from initially just an end to police killing and vigilante violence to a movement towards Black empowerment in general. I think it's important to note that the tactics used by Black Lives Matter are very diverse. Some protests are peaceful, some involve property crime, and some involve violent crime. Some are online and some are celebrity protests, such as like Colin Kaepernick kneeling at a football game. So for this reason, I'm going to consider a specific subset of protests to try and hone in on protests against police killings in particular. Specifically, I look at in-person gatherings under the banner of Black Lives Matter to protest any nonpartisan issue. So when I said in-person gatherings, that means I'm omitting online protests. I'm also omitting celebrity protests. So if Colin Kaepernick kneels in your city, I'm not saying that your city has Black Lives Matter movement. And when I say nonpartisan, I'm admitting minority of Black Lives Matter protests that are specifically about specific political people, such as like protests against Bernie Sanders or Trump, or someone like Ben Shapiro talking on a college campus. So the data is a stacked data set that's centered at the protest cohort and includes all census places with a population over 20,000 from 2000 to 2019, and the data is quarterly. So there's about 283 places that have a protest during the sample, and about 1,200 cities that don't have a protest during this sample. The main sources I use to measure protests come from Williamson 2018 published data, which includes the first year of Black Lives Matter. And for the remaining years, I web scraped the data from the ELAFRAME website. And to measure fatal encounters, or sorry, to measure police homicides, I use the fatal encounters data set. This data set has been shown to be the most comprehensive and has been used by other studies actually at this conference. But I specifically use fatal encounters that are non-suicides and are the result of asphyxiation, bludgeoning, gunshot, pepper spray, or taser. I wanted to talk about why more, but I'm not going to have time. The remaining sources are used to for pre-treatment controls, pre-BLM controls for one of the specifications that I'm not going to talk about for the sake of time. So this is a map of individual police homicides in red and Black Lives Matter protests in blue. I think the map pretty clearly shows that places that have a lot of police homicides also tend to have a lot of Black Lives Matter protests, but protests are also more common in places that just have a higher population, in college towns, such as the one I work at, places that have a higher share of the population that's Black. This figure shows the variation in time that I'm using. So it's the number of places by quarter that experienced their first Black Lives Matter protests. The vertical red line is the start of Black Lives Matter. So the figures suggest that the majority of places will have their first protests in either the first or second cohort, although there are some places that that are late and will have their first protest later. These figures show the binned average police homicides and police homicides per capita by protest status. I found these figures striking. So looking at just the figure on the left, police homicides, there's a very large level difference in police homicides between places that have a protest or don't have a protest prior to the start of Black Lives Matter, which is the vertical line. But the difference in trends is surprising. The slope is surprisingly similar. It's a little steeper for places that have protests, but not by much. And what's really surprising is after Black Lives Matter starts, there's almost no change in the trend for places that don't have a protest. And there's a pretty seemingly substantial drop in police homicides for places that do. Likewise, the figure on the right shows police homicides per capita, and now I weight by population. Now, there's almost no difference in trends. The level distance stays, but they're almost perfectly parallel prior to Black Lives Matter. And again, there's a what looks like a substantial drop in police homicides per capita in places with Black Lives Matter protests, and very little change in places that don't have a protest during the sample. So for the remainder of the paper, I'm going to try and make this a little more rigorous, those last two figures. So I'm going to do this using a stacked difference and difference with place cohort and year cohort fixed effects. So when I say stacked, I mean the data set is aligned by cohort. I'm going to walk you through this ugly equation now. So here, Y denotes the count lethal force in cohort I, census place I, and quarter T. N denotes the normalization variable. These are actually very contentious in the use of force literature. A lot of results hinge on what you choose, whether you don't normalize by population or by arrests, for example. D indicates treatment status. That is indicated for having at least one Black Lives Matter protest. Alpha is cohort place fixed effects. These control for all characteristics that are time invariant at the city level. And delta are cohort quarter fixed effects. These control for all characteristics that are time variant, but stable across cities. So the identifying assumption is that protests are exogenous, conditional on fixed effects. What that means is that all characteristics involved with selection into having a Black Lives Matter protest either do not vary over time at the city level, or if they do vary over time, are stable across cities. To gauge the robustness of the estimator and also to deal with some of those problems I talked about in the beginning, I'm going to contrast 4 different estimators, which just use different weights or normalization. So the first is just ordinary least squares. So the outcome is not normalized by anything, and weights are not applied. The second is per capita population weighted least squares. This is a common estimator used in the literature on social movements because it deals with the population-driven measurement error implicit to media-based data. The third is an inverse probability weighting estimator where the weights balance differences in pre-BLM characteristics between places with and without protests. And the fourth is a synthetic difference in difference estimator, where the weights balance differences in the police homicide trends between places with and without protests prior to Black Lives Matter, and also balance out any trends in police homicides for places that don't have Black Lives Matter protests before and after the start of Black Lives Matter, which can be thought of as like a double bias reducing estimator. If this first equation is correctly specified, all 4 of the estimators will be consistent. But if the first equation is wrong, equations or estimator 3 and estimator 4 can still be consistent if the weights are correctly specified. So they have what's called a double robustness property. So if all 4 of the estimators give a similar result, that is consistent with the first equation being good enough. So I mentioned that one of the estimators uses inverse probability weights. To get these weights, I use logistic ridge regression with tenfold cross-validation to select the penalty term, and they balance the 80 controls. I'm not going to go into detail what those controls are, but you can read them in the paper. Most of them are shown in previous literature to determine either Black Lives Matter protests or lethal use of force. So these are the main results of the paper. So in the top left in green, we have the, I'm showing the ordinary least squares regression estimates. So at the red vertical line and to the left is pre-Black Lives Matter. So, and the y-axis is the percent difference between places that with and without a protest. So we can see that there is no significant difference in police homicide trends prior to Black Lives Matter between places with and without protests. That's good and is consistent with the identifying assumption for the difference in difference model. However, 2 years before the protests begin, there's a the magnitude might be a bit concerning of the difference, even though it's not statistically significant. Maybe the test is just underpowered. Nonetheless, the estimator does suggest that there's a pretty substantial reduction in lethal use of force, about 17% over the 5 years following Black Lives Matter. And the reduction grows with time. So after the 5th year, there's almost 25% reduction in lethal use of force. In the top right corner, I report the population weighted least squares regression. This deals with the population driven variance, and doing so actually mitigates a lot of the pre-trend differences and increases the magnitude of the estimate to about a 20% reduction in lethal use of force per capita now. In the bottom left in purple, I report the estimates when weighting by the inverse probability weights. Doing so doesn't change the pre-trend differences by much, but does increase the magnitude of the estimate. Again, now there's about an 18.6% reduction in lethal use of force following the Black Lives Matter protests. In the bottom right corner, I report the synthetic difference in difference estimator. So as expected, the weights do balance out the pre-trend differences in lethal use of force between places with and without protest. The magnitude of these numbers are very, very small. And doing so increases the magnitude of the estimate by a lot, by about 5 percentage points. So according to this estimate, there's about a 21% reduction in lethal use of force following Black Lives Matter protests, and about a 40% reduction in the 5th year following the protests.
About 1 minute left.
1 minute? Oh my gosh. So none of these figures say anything about why. So to understand why, I do a similar estimates where I look at how the Black Lives Matter impacts local police agency characteristics. Some of the results are pretty striking. There's a 100% increase in the share of police agencies obtaining body cameras. There's almost 100% increase in the number of SARA-type problem-solving officers. This is a community policing initiative, and about a 50% increase in the number of officers giving stable local patrols, which again tries to foster community engagement with the officers. There's also a slight increase in the requirement of force documentation in police budget and a decrease in property arrests. There's some backlash maybe where there's a reduction in Black officer employment and college requirement for new recruits. So in summary, I think hopefully you believe that there's some evidence that Black Lives Matter protests have decreased police lethal use of force about 15 to 20%. And there's a corresponding expansion in body cameras and some community policing initiatives. I think that this is some pretty strong evidence that these protests are working as desired. The results are robust to the choice of estimator, population screen, specification, choice of data, and looking at protest size and frequency rather than just the dummy. The results do not hold when normalizing lethal force by arrests, whether it's property related or violent related or both. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Travis. And so I'm going to open up the floor for discussion among our panelist participants as well as the audience. If you all have questions, please submit them to the Q&A, and then I can read them to the presenter so that your questions can be answered. So first, I'll open it up to the panelists. Does anyone have any questions or comments for Travis?
I just want to warn about using uniform crime reports uncritically because the uniform crime reports are reported by local police departments. Even though they show up at the Justice Department, at the FBI, there are two critical components you should be aware of. One is the underreporting by police departments, sometimes over-reporting in police departments that's related to political cycles. And the second is the fact that there are missing observations. I'm not sure how you're dealing with the missing observations because sometimes police departments just don't submit the offense and arrest data. And so perhaps one of the reasons why you're finding odd results for the arrest effects has to do with the measurement error in arrests.
Can I ask a question? Travis, when I was most interested when you turned to that slide that showed the mechanisms, and what it looked to me like was that you showed that there were a whole lot more body cameras and different kinds of officers on the street after the protests. But is this a comparison between the Black Lives Matter protest cities and the cities without protests? Or is this just the increase over time in the affected cities?
This is the difference in difference estimate.
Oh, okay. All right.
Yeah, no, it's not the same specification because of the nature of the data. So depending on the data set, so most of these are from the lemmas data, I think is that how you pronounce the abbreviation, so that's just gonna be a 2-year panel, 2013, 2016. Okay. But some of it is annual. So the body camera data is annual, and same with like the property arrests and violent arrests.
Yeah, I mean, you could almost, if that's the case, you could almost title the paper like, "Do body cameras make a difference?" Given the magnitude of the change. I'm not sure, but you might, it might be interesting to see if you can try to empirically turn this into a test of the different mechanisms and see which ones make the difference. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so what I do in the paper is I try to justify the mechanisms and use of force in literature that already exists. So for body cameras, I think there's better studies than what I would be able to do with the data, such as that use like actual randomized control trials.
Yeah.
But I do think the literature is a bit split on everything. It seems like the use of force literature, it seems like if you have a question, there's every answer you could want that you can find. There's been Deepak, I think, was in the audience when I started. He had a very interesting paper on specifically looking at how the more prominent police killings change the property and violent arrests in the same data set. So, you know, I think other people can do it more justice than I'll be able to fit, but I'm glad that you found it interesting.
I've got a small suggestion for you, if you don't mind, Travis. Very nice paper. I'm really glad that you're looking at this. This isn't my area, but I do know a little bit about what's going on with recent developments in difference, and I'm sure you have you're probably aware of some of these things as well. But I'd really encourage you to try them, especially if you're thinking about using this as a job market paper. One would be the Bacon decomposition by Goodman-Bacon. Andrew Goodman-Bacon. That will help you figure out, like, are there particular city well, so I'm using city, but like it's your census tract, right? Like, are there particular data points that are driving your results more than others? The other thing that I would recommend is the new estimator developed by Callaway and Santana that was just published, I think, in Journal of Econometrics, and that will help with. He shows that, or they show that there's some bias in event studies that might that you might be able. So just two other sorts of estimators to try. But yeah, nice job.
I'll add in some tables doing so. Yeah, thank you for the recommendation.
Okay, I have one question from the Q&A from Deepak Premkumar. Travis, great presentation. Could the interpretation of the mechanisms be the reaction to a high-profile officer-involved fatality that causes protests rather than the protests themselves? For example, could the reduction of Black officers be from a loss of morale associated with the fatality rather than a departmental backlash?
Well, I think that your own paper showed that pretty well for a lot of these outcomes, and I really enjoyed it. I was very happy to see you in the audience. But I would argue that those high-profile police killings wouldn't be high-profile without the protests. So I think it's one and the same, you know? Yeah.
Yeah. And just one last comment in the Q&A from Greg Price. A quantile regression, particular median regression, would accommodate the sensitivity to outliers. And so with that, we're approaching our 22 minutes for this paper. So we will move to the next paper. So if you could stop sharing your screen, and I will present with joint work with Jamein and Cunningham, looking at the Edward Byrne program and its effect on incarceration rates. So just 1 second while I share my screen. So hopefully everyone can see my screen. If not, please let me know. So again, this is joint work with Jamein and Cunningham at the University of Memphis. And we're looking at the impact of intergovernmental transfers on racial disparities and incarceration, evidence from the Edward Byrne program. And this is a paper, a companion piece to the paper that we have forthcoming in JPAM that looks at how the Ed Byrne program, which is titled Edward Byrne Memorial State and Local Law Enforcement Assistance Grant Program, how that program impacted arrest, and in particular drug sales arrest is what we sort of focus on because of the stated purposes of the program. So just a brief outline. We'll go through the motivation and history, data, research, design, results, and then conclusion. And so as all of you all are very aware, it's been well established that public policies have led to historic rates of incarceration over the past 40 years. Most research has focused on the change from indeterminate to determinate sentencing and the war on drugs in general, with less attention being given to the role of federal interventions and how that directly influences state and local policies that may have led to mass incarceration. And I think even less is known about the role of intergovernmental transfers in influencing incarceration rates and racial disparities in incarceration. And so that was largely the motivation for our first paper on this, where we did find that this program did increase drug sales arrests for both Blacks and whites, as we'll see later, and increased racial disparities in arrests for Blacks and whites. Or excuse me, racial disparities in the Black-white racial disparities in arrest. And so a brief history of the program. The war on crime began with the Omnibus Crime Control Act of 1968, and that led to legislation that created the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, which provided grants to fund local policing agencies to meet new goals and policies and tactics developed under this program. This was really the first endeavor to provide funding to local governments to influence local law enforcement efforts. And then in 1973, we had the war on drugs that was officially declared by the Nixon administration with the creation of the DEA. And by the 1980s, the war on crime was supplanted by the war on drugs. Under the Reagan administration, the funds for the war on drugs shifted focus from treatment to crime prevention. And so in the 1986 Anti-Drug Abuse Act that was authorized, it provided state and local government with funding to improve apprehension, prosecution, adjudication, detention, and rehabilitation of drug offenders. And then the program, the Edward Byrne Memorial State and Local Law Enforcement Assistance Grant Program was established in the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1988. And the program was named after a New York officer that was slain while keeping watch over a drug informant. And the goal of the program was to combat drug crimes, violent crimes, and to improve coordination among the different parts of the criminal justice system. The Byrne program provided most funding under block grants, but also had discretionary grants, which is what we focus on in this paper. And it required states to match 25% of expenses. Most of the funds were used towards the creation of multi-jurisdictional task force to deal with drug trafficking. The Byrne grants through these multi-jurisdictional drug task force have been championed as effective in improving communication between law enforcement agencies. And much of the money went to developing these drug task force. So by 1991, there were 904 of these task force, which were responsible for over 250,000 arrests made in that year. We know mass incarceration was driven by public policy choices. Neil and Rick, and that should have said, I believe it's 2016, find racial disparities in incarceration are a result of racial disparities in arrest. And Cox and Cunningham, in our paper that's forthcoming, we find that racial disparities in drug sales arrests worsen due to the EBMG program. And so we're really wanting to understand, did the increases in drug sales arrests and the worsening of racial disparities in drug sales arrests, how did it impact incarceration rates, imprisonment rates, and in terms of prison admission rates and also imprisonment rates. And then we also look at jail admissions and jail incarceration or population rates as well. And then we do this by race to see whether or not there was a worsening of whether or not Blacks who we found to have had large increases in drug sales arrests in our previous paper, whether or not that led to increases in incarceration rates for Blacks as well as whites. And so this just is a demonstration of the distribution of funding for the Byrne program from 1989 to 1994. And you can see a big chunk of the money, the majority of the money went to establishing these multi-jurisdictional drug task force. But then the second largest spending side was on corrections, but there was also spending on drug testing and information systems, et cetera. And so as a result, our sort of conceptual relationship between the program and incarceration is that we think that the increased funds used for policing, prosecution, court effectiveness, and incarceration led to investments in programs and technologies that increase drug arrest rates, and that the increase in the number of cases successfully adjudicated because of the collaboration that took place with forensic labs. would lead to better case outcomes, or maybe more convictions and case outcomes, and increases in funding for corrections would sort of may all suggest that incarceration rates would increase as a result of this program. And then also just to get a little bit further into sort of the connection between sort of this increased contact with policing and then that translating into incarceration, increases in, we found in our other paper that there would be increases in racial disparities in arrest rates that could possibly lead to increases in the Black-white incarceration gap. So we're trying to understand that now. And so there are many reasons why that could happen. It could be incentive-driven policing, or it could be increased in predatory or heavier handed policing because of these programs that led to greater contact among African Americans in terms of arrest. And then our findings, our findings suggest this should also impact the flow of individuals incarcerated, given that we found that there were these increases in racial disparities in arrests, and in particular, much larger increases in Black drug cells arrests than white drug cells arrests. And so this should at least impact admission, so the flow of individuals who are being incarcerated. And so just to briefly highlight some of the results from our other paper, that also kind of helped to conceptualize the relationship as well, or at least suggest that maybe there would actually also be an ambiguous effect where the program wouldn't necessarily lead to increases in incarceration. We did find that after the program, there was a decrease in total crime, which was really driven by decreases in property crime, because as you can see, total violent crime wasn't impacted by the program. But property arrest and property crime did decrease after the program. So we're sort of, so this would suggest that maybe there's some ambiguity in terms of the findings that in terms of what we might find with this program, especially if property crime and robbery, which we also found significantly decreased after receipt of Byrne grant. If those decreased, if property crimes decrease and arrests for property crimes decrease, then this might lead to decreases in incarceration and incarceration rates, and decreases in admission rates as well. So the result conceptually may actually be ambiguous. And so here's just a figure where that shows the racial disparities that increased due to drug sales arrests from our prior paper from 1982 to 2009. In that paper, we also use an event study approach. And so you can see here that racial disparities increased by 1 for every 1,000 Black individual, 1 drug sales arrest for every 1,000 Black individual after receipt of the program. So the data we used to analyze this question about whether or not the Byrne program, how that impacted incarceration rates and whether or not it led to increases in Black incarceration is the Consolidated Federal Funds Report. So we used the date the grant was issued in order to determine treatment. The Consolidated Federal Funds Report also contains geographical codes, and it also has information on the size of the grant. But we focus on grants made from 1987 to 1997. And then for data, for our incarceration data, we use data from the Vera Institute. And so they collected their data from a number of sources, including the National Corrections Reporting Program, Census of Jails, and Annual Survey of Jails. So we use the Vera Institute, the 2018 version of their data for the periods 1983 to 2004 for prison admissions, jail admissions, jail population, and prison population. And the data we have data by county from this source. But one caveat is the jail population data that we have by county and race is from 1990 to 2004. So we have a bit of a restricted window for jail population data by race. And then we use county and city data books for our demographic data. Our final sample includes 482 counties, of which 282 are treated. And we also restrict the sample to counties that have at least 50,000 individuals and who report at least 30 of the 32 years of prison admissions data for Blacks and whites from 1983 to 2014. And so the research design we use is an event study framework following Callaway and Santa Ana. And we restrict our sample to the treated only because of the biases that were mentioned earlier. And there's also some imbalance in our sample as well between treated and not treated individuals. And so we use the timing of treated to identify a more unbiased average treatment effect on the treated. And so our outcomes, again, are prison admissions rate, imprisonment or the population prison rate, jail admissions rate, and then the jail incarceration or jail population rate. And the treated are, just briefly about this estimator, the treated are split into timing groups, and of those treated at each period and controls of not yet treated within the same period. And then we conduct stacked regressions where we estimate for each treatment timing group the pre and post treatment effects. And then these are and then we calculate a weighted average over all of these pre and post treatment effects across the timing groups. And then we estimate our 90 and 95% confidence intervals are estimated from block bootstrap estimation using 250 draws. So just briefly, because I know I'm running out of time here, I have about 3 minutes left. The summary statistics, you can see that between the never treated and the treated, there is some sample imbalance. The treated have larger populations. They significantly larger population. They significantly are less likely to vote Republican. They are more likely to be urban areas, have higher proportion Black population, higher proportion of the population with 4 or more years of education, greater proportion of the population with female-headed households, and a smaller proportion of the population that is white. For the prison admissions per 100,000 residents, and then prison population per 100,000 residents. They also have a smaller proportion that's white for that as well. So just to go right into our results, because I have 2 minutes left. So our event study results using the Callaway and Santa Ana approach, we actually find that prison admission rates actually decline. By year 3, we see a significant decline. There's not much that happens with the prison population rate. This is not necessarily unexpected because we know from prior research that the prison population rate really, the prison population rate has more to do with truth in sentencing laws and laws that led to longer sentences for certain types of crimes like violent crimes. And we see the effect of the Byrne program on drug sales arrest. But we'd see a decline in prison Black admission rates for the treated relative to the not yet treated group. That starts by year 3 post grant receipt. So I think this was a bit of a surprise. This was a bit of a surprising finding, but maybe not so much since we know that property crimes also decreased during this time, and property arrests decreased. But we also find that white admissions rate didn't experience as much of a decline as Blacks, but they did experience a decline up to about year 4, or a decline over the period post-treatment. And that decline is significant in year 4 post-treatment, but then it picks back up a little bit. So I didn't mention earlier, something that's nice about the event study framework is that we can see that whether there's violation of the parallel trends assumptions, and so far everything has looked fairly good. I'm out of time, so I'll just wrap up very quickly. These are the Black population prison rates and white population prison rates. And we can see here that there's no significant change there, although there appears to be a little bit of an increase for white population rates. And then looking at Black jail admissions rates, there's no effect for Black jail admissions rates, nor is there an effect for Black jail population rates, or white jail population rates, or jail population rates in general. We look at heterogeneous effects by region, median Black population, 1985 prison admission rate, county population, and then using the Friar Crack Cocaine Index, and qualitatively our conclusions remain the same. So just to conclude, after receipt of the Byrne grant funding, we see significant decreases in the prison admissions by year 3 post-grant receipt. Prison admissions for Blacks have a significant notable decline, while the decrease for whites is less pronounced and only significant at year 4. And this may be driven by the declines that we saw in our prior paper on property crimes and arrest. There was no impact on the imprisonment rate or the jail admission rate or jail incarceration rate. And we are looking to obtain data on probation, because it could be that that's where we may see the increases in drug sales arrests translating into more probation, especially if those are terms of the of any sort of plea deals or what have you. Any suggestions are appreciated, and so I will open it up now for comments and questions from the panel and the audience. So Benga Aguilar has a question. I know you limit the sample to 50K, but I wonder about the rural aspect, given that many rural counties use prisons as jobs program. A number of prisons are built to attract jobs, and I wonder if the Byrne program helped facilitate that. That may be the case. We did not look at that in particular. That sounds like another research question to me. We did not look at that in particular with this paper. Another question in the Q&A, are the treated and untreated compared on the basis of some matching metric? If so, what type? We're using the Callaway and Santa Ana method within an event study approach, where we use the timing of treatment such that all of our sample consists of the 282 that were treated at some point. And we create sort of these treatment groups where we use by specific years. And so at a specific year, we use counties that are treated in that year, and then individuals who were not treated until 7 years after that year. So for example, for 1997, for the counties treated in 1997, those who were treated after 2004 are used as controls for that particular treatment group. So we're not using any sort of matching metric here. We're really using the timing of treatment to identify this effect. Are there other questions or comments from the panel? Bill, we were very happy to see you in our panel, because we thought you might have some good insight, given your prior history and with regards to our findings as well.
Yeah, I know your data ended in 2004. A lot's happened in the last 15 years, but some of your trends, particularly on Black-white admissions, are kind of prefiguring fairly substantial drops in admissions. So I know you can only deal with the data you have, but I encourage you to continue this and just explore the last decade or so with some of the future work. And on the question about rural prisons and jails, I like that you distinguish between prisons and jails, because if prisons are built in rural areas, they could still house inmates who came from urban areas. And jails, on the other hand, we talk about a community institution. So I don't think the location of the prison is as important as the location of the jail in the analysis. So.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions or comments? No, all right. So we will move on then to our next presenter, who will be Janna Johnson, Samuel Myers, Greg Price, and Bill Sabol. And I believe Bill Sabol is presenting.
Yes, I am. Thanks. You can see who the co-authors are. Our paper has been motivated by big decreases in Black female imprisonment since the turn of the 21st century. The blue line in this graph just shows the number of Black women in prison. In the 90s, it doubled, and since 2000, not quite halved. And then at the same time, the number of white women in prison has increased. So we're curious about this divergence. The rates of incarceration show similar patterns. White female imprisonment rates are going up since 2000. Black female imprisonment rates are going down. The overall racial disparity has gone from about since 2000, has gone from about 6 to 1 to about 2 to 1. So fairly substantial changes. In the history of incarceration, this is anomalous, where we've seen sustained decreases in racial disparity between Blacks and whites, particularly for women. There have been recent decreases for men, but they're not as big. But we've done some work on this on another paper, trying to understand the sources of these changes. And a lot of it is, as Robynn shows, driven by admissions. In particular, fairly substantial decreases in drug admissions for Black women by about 2/3 over this period, while white female admissions increased, or the share of white female admissions were about equal among drugs, violent, and property offenses. We did some simulations to ask the question, which factor, admissions or length of stay, accounts for more of the change in the white and Black female imprisonment rates. And when we hold admissions constant at 2000 and allow releases to vary, we can see that it's the admissions rate that are responsible for most of the increase in the Black and white female imprisonment rates. Again, I think just picking up on Robynn's point, that reflects some shift in focus of policy, sort of not so much a lessening, somewhat of a lessening of sentencing severity, but also some other factors that are involved. So our question is motivated by what's behind the fall in Black female imprisonment. And again, based on some other work we've been doing, looking at the relationship between the child welfare system and the criminal justice system, we started to look at the relationship between foster care placements and imprisonment. And basically, I've just put side by side the imprisonment rate graph with the foster care placement rate graph. And the blue lines for Black show that since 2000, Black child foster care placement rates have fallen considerably, along with the fall in Black female imprisonment rates. White foster care placement rates were kind of flat, decreased, and went up. So the question became, well, could changes in foster care populations be related to changes in Black female imprisonment rates? Now, that raises the question of how imprisonment and foster care are related. And it's probably pretty obvious to think that if a mother is removed from a family by incarceration, that could have an impact on a child's placement in foster care. And survey data that the Bureau of Justice Statistics computes on parents in prison finds that probably about a third of parents, these are data from 2004, who are incarcerated, have their kids in foster care. A majority are cared by other relatives. So there is some relationship there. But our approach is motivated or was informed by some local area studies that looked at the chronology of petty crime, substance use, arrest, incarceration, and child placement. A study done in New York City by the Byrne Institute in the early to mid 2000s actually found that in a vast majority of the cases they looked at, the removal of the child from a setting that was perceived to be dangerous because a parent either used drugs or may be involved in petty crimes and so on, preceded the incarceration, and the incarceration came later. And this is particularly the case for parents or mothers who were substance users, substance abusers. So this kind of led to the question, well, could foster care removals have an impact on female imprisonment rates, and in particular with changes in federally led changes in child welfare? Have there been improvements in foster care systems that have reduced the use of out-of-home placement and maybe affected this relationship that was observed in these local studies? So our approach is to, while we'd love to have individual level data like the study in New York, where you could link parents and kids and their placements, those are hard to come by. So we're falling back on using aggregate data and using an instrumental variables approach to try to correct for the endogeneity between, or our hypothesized endogeneity between foster care and imprisonment. In this work, we're both looking at the impact of incarceration on foster care outcomes and foster care placement on incarcerated outcomes. I'm only going to talk about the foster care on incarcerated women, but our main challenges in this is trying to find reasonable instruments to identify this relationship. And our review is sort of leading to the conclusion that we can find structural instruments and not necessarily individual-based instruments that could work. So in our approach, we looked at work that the Children's Bureau and the federal government has done in child welfare reform. And beginning at the turn of the 21st century, the Children's Bureau started conducting these periodic reviews of state child welfare systems to ensure conformity with federal welfare, child welfare requirements, determine what's happening to kids and children, assisting states in helping children and families achieve positive outcomes. Key among those outcomes were permanent placement and reduction in the use of out-of-home placement. The Children's Bureau conducted these children and family services reviews in all states between 2000 and 2018. They've done 3 rounds of this. They're assessing states. It's almost mind-boggling to think about this, on 45 performance indicators in several outcome categories and system factors. And most importantly for our work is the idea that some of the outcome categories they're looking at are the conformance with permanent placement, the continuity of family relationships, and the connection with children being preserved, and that efforts to enhance families' capacity to provide for their children's outcomes, and as well as ensuring children and then parents are receiving appropriate services to meet their needs. And it's in that place where they're trying to assist the states in conforming with federal child welfare rules that that nexus that we talk that motivated us about the family setting and the removal of a kid leading to incarceration, that's where we see these instruments as applying or potentially applying in our work. As I mentioned, 3 rounds of these reviews have been done. No state had received substantial conformity, and they had to develop performance programs. So in our work, we created a set of indicators for each state that indicated the year a review was initiated plus 2 years to allow for some time for change for each of the 3 rounds of reviews. And there's variation across the states and over time in these rounds. Now, one question that's raised about these, or several questions are raised about these instruments or the use of these instruments. One is whether or not states are randomly selected into these CFSRs, whether states could have made changes to the welfare systems in anticipation of the reviews and the strength of these as instruments. Our understanding of the program is that the federal government determined the dates for reviews, not the states. I mean, they did collaborate with states and let them know, but it was primarily federally determined, not state determined. I also think that if there's some anticipation of a review, well, that in a sense is an effect of a review that we would want to look at. But also thirdly, no state passed all of the review items. So that's an indication that states, even if they anticipated the reviews, couldn't correct all their potential child welfare problems. Okay, so we constructed a panel, state level panel from 2000 to 2016, motivated by the question, are there racial differences in the effect of foster care on female imprisonment using OLS and instrumental variables estimates. We integrated a database using some of the data sources that have been identified already, National Prisoner Statistics, Foster Care Reporting System, Children's Bureau data on these reviews, population, crime rates, drug overdose death rates, teen birth rates, and some SES measures. One reason why we use the drug overdose death rate, when I was talking about the mechanism of a child welfare worker visiting a home and finding it a potentially, quote, dangerous setting for a kid because a mother or parent might be using drugs or substance abuse, we would have liked to have had drug arrest data by race, by sex, but in the FBI reports, you can only get data by race or by sex, not the combination of them. So we use the CDC multiple cause of death files to identify drug overdose rates over time by state. Key measures are the foster care rate. All these are race specific: foster care rates, imprisonment rates, confirmed maltreatment rates, overdose death rates, and the violent crime property rates aren't race specific, they're aggregate. Briefly, foster care rates differ between white and black children on average in the time period by about 3 to 1. Female imprisonment rates by 3.5 to 4 to 1, and so on and so forth. So first question is, how strong are these CFSR, how well do these CFSR reviews perform as instruments? And I can tell you, we did a bunch of estimates, and they are sensitive to specification. They're sensitive whether or not we weight the data by population, by covariates that are included, and so on and so forth. So what we found was our best instrument was using the 3rd round of review, which came later in the period. And that's also, if you remember from the graph, the later in the period is where some of the biggest changes in both imprisonment and foster care occurred. And the performance of the instruments indicated by the table, the first stage F statistics and the Durbin scores and the Wu-Hausman, all are not unreasonable. So we're satisfied that we have something. Then briefly, our regression results show that, well, we don't, in this, the specifications a combination of log linear and log log. So foster care rates are in natural logs, and we don't find any effect of foster care on female imprisonment rates. So there's no impact within races or in contributing to the decrease in the black-white female disparity. On the other hand, foster care can't be a cause of the difference or the narrowing of the gaps in female incarceration rates. On the other hand, the white female drug overdose death rate is a contributor to the increase in white female imprisonment rates. That overdose, one point change in the death rate obviously has about a 1%, 1.5% increase in the female imprisonment rate. So there's a differential effect between white and black women in terms of drug overdose deaths. And again, we're using the overdose to characterize that nexus of review of what's going on in families and whether kids are being removed prior, part of that removal, part of the removal prior to incarceration. So we do find an effect of the overdose death rates for women, for white women, not for black women. And part of that is due to the much more rapid increase over time in white female drug overdose rates as compared to black female overdose death rates. The white rates are about 50% higher, but they increased linearly over time. The black rates were relatively flat, but in the most recent years have started to increase. Okay, so what does this all mean? Well, first of all, in terms of these instruments, in some respects, it was a long shot to think that we could use state level practices to identify this relationship. But I think despite the fact that the performance of the instruments varied across specifications, we did find some specifications where they were fairly strong. So it's suggestive that this federally led effort could be important in understanding changes in foster care and in isolating that relationship between foster care and incarceration. Kind of related to this, I think the state level might just be too high of a level to pick up some of these impacts of foster care and incarceration. As Robyn was talking about, and as Travis's piece also talked about, we know there's wide variation within states across size of plays. So one issue we'd like to begin to explore in the future is to look at within state variation at the county level and measure the extent to which county agencies are compliant with federal standards as a way to better identify that relationship. So the bottom line, the null effects could be due to the weakness of the instrument, but we're also think there's some promise in developing this further. Just a couple other general comments. I didn't share the results for this, but again, consistent with points that Robyn was making, when we included sentencing policy variables, and I know that they, in the imprisonment rate, I know there's some questions about how those are treated. There were a lot of reforms going on in the past 2 decades, particularly in mandatory sentencing to reduce mandatory sentences for certain quantities of drugs and other crimes. And we did find that the reforms lowered black female imprisonment rates. And that's also consistent with the point I made at the outset that there's been a substantial decrease in black women admitted to prison in the last decade and a half, 2 decades for drug crimes. So just conclusions, we want to move forward with this, trying to look at foster care compliance gaps at the county level. And same thing with the state policies, explore this relationship more, explore more the within state variation across counties in some of these patterns. And I'll stop there and respond to any questions as best as I can.
Okay, we have about 4 minutes left for questions. I see Greg, your co-author, has a comment in the Q&A as well. Perhaps we can exploit some sort of regression discontinuity based on cutoffs in PIP and periodic reviews or CFSRs. I presume these evaluation metrics have some thresholds determining eligibility for mandated child welfare programs.
Yes, they have penalties associated with them. So yes, they do have cutoffs and measures of the extent to which the child welfare agencies are complying with the federal standards.
Okay. Are there any questions or comments from the panelists? Okay.
I would note just that the data and the approach is entirely surprising and interesting to me. I had no idea some of these trends that you're investigating, and you did a very nice job. And so thanks so much for sharing that with us.
Thanks.
Any other questions or comments? No, well, if not, we can circle back around to your paper again, Bill. Someone comes up with questions at the end. We should have a few minutes at the end for questions and comments as well. So, excuse me, why don't we move on to the next paper, which is by Stephen McMullen on Can Baby Bonds Address Historic Racial Injustice?
Thank you, Robyn. Okay. What I'm doing here is very different than what we have in the other papers in this session, and indeed very different than what we have in a lot of other presentations at the conference here today. This is much more of a kind of politics, philosophy, and economics style paper, because what I want to do is I want to expand the facility of economists basically to make moral and ethical justifications for economic policies that we're considering. And this is part of a long research agenda of mine, but I owe this particular project in particular to a co-author of mine. We were writing a book together, it's a debate, and he challenged me that I was using justice and theories of justice in kind of loose ways, which I think is probably common in the economics discipline, where we're just not trained to think in really precise ways about these things. And so this paper is kind of my way of attempting to fix the problem of his critique and to do a better job. And it fits really nicely with, of course, the stratification economics theme of the social economics sessions that we have here today. So that's the big picture. The goal here is to ask whether or not different ways of thinking about justice would offer different kinds of justifications for different kinds of policies that we might propose in order to address them. And so I'm going to focus on baby bonds because this is a somewhat recent, last decade or two. This policy has come up and it's been proposed particularly by Black leaders and Black economics scholars such as Sandy Darity, Derek Hamilton, both of whom gave really nice addresses at this conference. And they've proposed that baby bonds are a way of trying to chip away at the racial wealth gap, which is a real problem of current interest. And so I want to try to take that argument and that proposal, and I want to try to sharpen it by thinking about what kinds of justice, what kinds of ways of thinking about justice would work with this kind of proposal and which ones wouldn't. And the end goal that I want to give you here, or the end conclusion here, is that if we think more carefully about justice, I think we'll be able to make much better headway at coming up with policies, coming up with agreement on policies, because we'll be hitting some areas of real disagreement. Okay, that's a lot of preamble. Here's the outline of the argument I want to give you. The paper is 6,000 words or so, I think, in the latest draft. And so I'm just going to have to touch on the outline of the argument, and you'll kind of see the way the logic works. First, I'll talk about the details of the baby bonds proposal so that we're all on the same page there. I'll probably have to breeze over the different kinds of harm that have a kind of racist legacy within the history of the United States. I think a lot of you are familiar with the vocabulary there, but a lot of that rests on the work of people doing stratification economics. And then I'm going to spend some real time talking about two of the many different ways we could talk about economic justice, the two that I think I see most commonly when people are talking about racial justice in particular. And so that's where I'll spend much of my time. And in the end, what I'm going to try to tell you is that some of our common ways of thinking about economic justice work with some kinds of racist economic harms and not with others, and that some policies are appropriate responses to some kinds of harm with some kinds of frameworks of economic justice and not with others. And so paying attention to the underlying theories of justice will allow us to really sharpen the way we're making these proposals and sometimes also critiques of other proposals that other folks will make. So that's the argument. But let me start with the big picture here. Economists tend to justify economic policy in pragmatic and utilitarian terms. It's kind of what we're good at. Of course, partly this is because of the utilitarian roots of economics discipline. Partly it's because a lot of economists are actually utilitarians, right, when they think about the world. But partly it's just because we're trained to do the kind of careful data analysis, weighing the costs and the benefits, measuring the causal effects of things, that we kind of focus there. But lots of times the argument that we're actually trying to make does depend on a conception of justice. I think I've seen this grow, particularly in the economics discipline in recent years, as questions of economic justice have become more common in our politics. At this year's ASSA meetings, across the plenary addresses, I mean, economic justice has been a major theme. And I think it behooves us as economists to start to do a really good job talking about justice in ways that allow us to bridge some divides, but also make real proposals. Now, we often disagree about justice. We operate with different standards. We can't escape theories of justice. When it comes to baby bonds, what I think is too often done is that we might assume a policy that's meant to address something like the racial wealth gap is an appropriate response to something like structural racism overall, and it just isn't. So what I'm going to argue here is that baby bonds does make sense as a policy, but a policy only in response to a particular kind of harm with a particular kind of justice goal. And that this is really important for noting, because when we note that, it becomes obvious that passing a policy like baby bonds, or even something like reparations or affirmative action, doesn't rule out our need to do other policies as well, and that we're going to have to sort of have a collection of policies to correct different harms, and also because there's different kinds of justice that we're aiming for. All right, the baby bonds details. 4 things I want you to know about baby bonds. First, they have a real progressive impact. The goal in these things is to create a savings account for every child when they're born. Deposits are made into these accounts by the US federal government. Children that are poor, either in income or wealth terms, would get more money deposited over years by the federal government, and more wealthy children would get less or no money deposited. The Cory Booker proposal uses income as a test. The proposal that I'm referring to more often from Hamilton and Darity uses wealth as a test. This does chip away at the racial wealth gap, according to a recent study, particularly among young people. Certainly it wouldn't work for older folks who wouldn't get the accounts. It's worth noting this is a universal policy in the sense that it is at least ostensibly race neutral. So this is a policy that would apply to all children born in the US, at least as it's proposed. But the effect would be would disproportionately impact minorities in the US because of the really substantial income and wealth gaps between different racial groups in the US. And then there's a paternalistic element that's also interesting, and that is that upon reaching adulthood, the money can be accessed by the child, well, the adult at this point, but they can only spend it on a couple of things in these proposals, usually a house, maybe college education, moving it into a retirement fund. And, you know, people are going to love or hate that particular element of the policy, but it is there. Okay. I'm gonna skip over this. It's worth noting, I might need to refer back to this later, that there are different kinds of racist problems in our economy, and they're not all the same, and they don't all warrant the same solution. Now, the two big theories of justice I'm going to talk about, I think are the most common in this literature. We often think about justice in what I'm going to say is compensatory terms, and often in terms of economic opportunity. It's worth noting right from the outset that both Hamilton and Darity in the conference this year and in recent years have been talking also in terms of an economic bill of rights. And basic economic rights would be another justice framework we could refer to that's interesting. I don't talk about that here in this presentation. I mentioned it a couple times in my paper, but that's worth focus somewhere else. But compensatory justice in particular is important when we talk about racial justice in the US, because this is the kind of justice we're usually referring to when we're trying to come up with the appropriate recompense or compensation for a victim that's experienced some real harm, okay, or that has had some crime committed and they're the victim. And so this way of thinking asks us to carefully identify the party that caused the harm, identify the victim, and identify the magnitude and type of damage. It's a real kind of legal sort of tort metaphor here. And this is a great way of thinking about justice if we want to make the argument for racial reparations, for instance. And this is the frame that Darity and Mullen use in their recent book, arguing in favor of reparations, because the framing fits. There's a crime that we're all used to thinking about and understanding. That crime has specific victims. They identify the U.S. federal government as the party that owes the compensation, and that the descendants of enslaved people are, of course, the victims. And then they offer lots of different ways of thinking about how to measure the damages. So it fits there, but it's worth noting that this way of thinking about justice, and racial justice in particular, which is really common, doesn't fit very well with a proposal like baby bonds. And I would argue that it probably also doesn't fit real well if we want to make a case for affirmative action or some other kinds of racial justice programs either. If we want to talk about baby bonds, just off the top, real quick, you'll note that the policy details don't fit a compensatory justice framework. Baby bonds are targeted to help the young, and the babies are going to be the ones furthest away from the harm that we're thinking of fixing. Baby bonds are a universal policy. They're not targeted by race at all. We do have a disproportionate impact only because of the racial wealth gap. And there's been lots of pushback against the paternalistic restrictions. And there's a really interesting critique about these kinds of restrictions and universal policies in general. And in this case, note that the paternalistic restrictions would in particular push people towards those institutions in society that have historically been the sites of structural racism and discrimination, right? It's the housing market, it's the education system, and it's the financial markets where you would then end up using these funds. And so there's I think, a real legitimate critique of this policy if we're thinking about racial economic justice in these compensatory terms. Now, there's so much more to be said, but let's flip to a different frame of economic justice. Let's think about economics or equality of opportunity here. This is, I think, sort of a common broad theme in the way at least Americans think about economic justice. And it's actually really common in the moral philosophy literature, both for conservatives and for progressives. So this is a standard of justice that aims to give everybody kind of an equal starting point. It's sometimes called a starting gate theory, whereas if we have everybody start out with equal opportunities, that is, opportunities that don't vary based on unchosen characteristics, then everybody can then make their own choices and they'll realize different outcomes. Some will be richer, some will be poor, depending on what occupations they choose and how many hours they work and these kinds of things. But that the inequalities that result might be more just if they're starting out from a similar starting point. Okay, so there's lots of literature on this. I think Anderson and Arneson are two places that you could go for really good descriptions. Note that equality of opportunity does not really offer a very good justification for something like reparations for past crimes. But it does actually provide a really nice framework for condemning labor market discrimination and structural racism in the education system, in the criminal justice system, and some other places. So I think this is really a potent framework when we're thinking about racial justice. but there's some real problems. So let me start with the problems before I give you the upside. First, it's worth noting that equality of opportunity arguments tend to focus on structures and institutions. Conservatives will often use, well, let me talk about that in a second. So it doesn't tend to focus on redistribution. You can make redistribution kinds of arguments with equality of opportunity philosophical frameworks. But usually the immediate focus would be on making sure that the legal institutions are appropriate. Now, Hamilton mentioned that he's suspicious about equality of opportunity in his plenary just a couple of days ago. And he noted that this kind of thinking is too often used by conservatives, usually, to then turn the blame for oppression on the oppressed, or blame for disparity on the oppressed. So the argument would go something like this. A conservative frame would think of economic opportunity in formal terms only, usually. That is, equality of opportunity in the most conservative frame would worry only about legal barriers. And so once you get rid of all the legal barriers, once Jim Crow is gone, then any disparities that result are the result of a culture of poverty or poor choices or something of the sort. And we've all heard these kinds of arguments. And this, I think, makes people rightly suspicious of equality of opportunity kinds of framing. I think, though, Scanlon uses equality of opportunity here. When he describes it, he says equality of opportunity framing is actually a kind of a prerequisite for a moral inequality. And this actually sets us up for a really powerful critique of racism and racism in the economy, which is to say that we have really good evidence that opportunities just haven't been and are not equal between Black people and white people in the U.S. economy. And so this framework gives us a real way of then setting up that with that evidence, a case for some kind of policy change that's structural. Now, Darity notes, moreover, that equalizing wealth is particularly important if we want to create opportunities, and equalizing wealth, particularly in terms of wealth for startup funds and for education and for houses and whatnot. And this actually lends itself really well to the kind of policy the baby bonds are making, or the kind of changes that baby bonds would make. Now, I'm out of time, so I should just note here that my main conclusions then is that if we want to make a philosophical justification for baby bonds, I think we could do it with a couple different proposals. One would be an equality of opportunity kind of framework, but note that, and we should do so then, I think, very explicitly. And that when we do, note that this complements the kind of pragmatic, this will actually work and have good effects defense that economists are used to making. Because when we make a defense on the grounds of economic justice, it's a kind of prerequisite for the good policy, effective policy arguments that we make in other kinds of economic research. And the two together would make a much more strong case for a particular policy change. And I'll leave it there. I have, of course, a bunch of citations if anybody wants those. The PowerPoint presentation and my paper are available through the app.
Thank you so much, Stephen. We have about 5 minutes, 5.5 minutes or so for Q&A. And it looks like we have one question from Greg Price so far in the Q&A. If we are to take Nietzsche seriously, and perhaps we should, that there are no moral phenomena, only moral interpretation of phenomena, it seems that morality, justice are ultimately held hostage to the opinions of the median voter. So perhaps notions of race and fairness need to be embedded in a public choice framework where morality of justice are some universal justice or some universal priors that exist, but must be selected into by voters in a democratic polity.
You know, there is a very real sense in which we have really deep disagreements about justice, and we don't have a common sort of foundational start. Like we all have to agree on this justice, and therefore we can work from that. But that said, there are the kinds of the theories of justice I'm working with here. I chose in part because they're really powerful, and they're the kinds of ideas of justice that have a lot of kind of political potency to them. So they might not be the right theories of distributive justice. I think both of them are very helpful. But they're the ways people often think about justice. So if you want to make an argument about something being unjust, it's very helpful to make them in some of these terms. So you're right, we do need to pay attention to how people are thinking about justice. But there is some consensus, I think, on this, even if it's not universal. And we could have more consensus, perhaps, if we subject our ideas of justice to some real scrutiny. I don't know if that answers the question for sure. I didn't mention Nietzsche.
No, I think he was just mentioning him as sort of an alternative theory that you could maybe incorporate, or if I speak for him, from what I interpret from his writing. Are there any other comments or questions, suggestions for Stephen?
So I typed in a comment in the chat window, but I'll make it verbally here. You know, the first is that you should consider the Rawlsian justice as well as Byrne justice in your evaluation of the baby bonds. Yeah. I also think that it'd be useful for your paper to take on more explicitly this paradox that one of the biggest advocates for baby bonds also happens to be one of the leading theorists of stratification economics. And so you kind of, in passing, mentioned this possible contradiction between advocating a race-neutral remedy when in fact your theoretical apparatus is one that justifies a race-conscious remedy. And so I think it's helpful taking that on a little more explicitly. And I do talk a little bit about that in my book, Race Neutrality, Rationalizing Remedies to Racial Inequality. And so you might find some helpful insights in that publication.
You know, that's really interesting. And I do deal with that much more explicitly in my paper. And it's exactly right. And I think Darity, when Sandy talks about this stuff, he is very explicit in saying that, for instance, baby bonds are not the solution. Like, we wouldn't do that instead of reparations, for example. And also that the proposal for baby bonds, as it was written like a decade ago by him and Derek Hamilton, they use a really political, sort of pragmatic justification. So they're not saying, this is how we achieve like real justice, but this might get us closer and it might be politically possible. And that's not the best justification for something, but in an era in which like nothing's getting through Congress, it has some power. And so I think if my interpretation of Darity's work and Hamilton's work is that baby bonds is just one small part of a larger platform and of things that need to be done. And some of those things would end up being race neutral and some of them shouldn't be. But I think there's, I also mentioned in my paper that there's a real tension sort of built, like our whole liberal framework leans toward race neutral solutions. And those race neutral solutions are often not going to be a good fit for the kinds of injustice we're trying to actually address. And baby bonds is totally falls prey to that critique. And so, and I think that becomes more obvious the more we pay attention to these philosophical ideas of justice. Now, there's more could be said about using a Rawlsian framework. You're totally right. That would be if I used like all of the theories of justice that I wanted to get straight in my head, the paper would be like 15,000 words instead of 6. And you know. But that would be a live candidate, and I think more writing needs to be done on that. and it's probably on my to-do list.
Right. So that makes our 22 minutes for your paper. I do agree that we focus on race neutral policies, but part of that I think has to do with that's what people believe is politically feasible, right? So we can open discussion up for that at the end after our last but certainly not least presenter, Hanna Szymborska, and she will be presenting on patterns of wealth accumulation and inequality in the intersection of gender and race for the case of the USA.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me here, and thank you to the selection committee for selecting my contribution. Well, first, let me just say, wow, really incredible papers so far. I'm really learning a lot, and I'm very grateful for being able to present. I'm just trying to figure out how to go into presentation mode. So I hope you can see the presentation.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, excellent. So similarly to the previous presenter, I think, this ties together quite nicely, perhaps some of the issues, the discussions we've been going through today. I will be focusing on wealth as well, specifically looking at patterns of wealth accumulation and wealth inequality in the US over time, paying particular attention to the difference in these patterns at the intersection of gender and race. And the topic doesn't really need too much motivation, but I just wanted to highlight the recent, some not so recent, some more recent than others, developments in the economy, in the society that are structural, that really highlight the importance of looking at wealth inequality and intersectional wealth inequality specifically. I put here just a selection really of the great works that has been already done on the historical legacies of structural discrimination and inequality, particularly by race, but to some extent by gender as well in the US. And we have seen, I think, in the example of the especially the subprime era, the 90s and the 2000s, followed by the Great Recession, and even more so right now with the COVID crisis, the very deep reach of the more systemic or macro level processes onto these micro or meso group individual level inequalities, and vice versa. So I am coming to this panel as a macroeconomist that kind of is exploring the more say meso micro issues, and this is perhaps why I'm coming at this issue from this particular more institutional angle. And again, the topic needs no introduction in terms of how the rise of structured finance has fueled very unsustainable homeownership among, not just low-income households, but that had a very certain gendered and racial profiling. And with that, at the back of other structural changes, like quite sluggish growth of wages for women and for people of color in the US, as well as that unsustainable asset stripping, access to credit that has been made possible through the subprime lending expansion, has been associated with dramatic, over-indebtedness among these vulnerable groups, and that has, been led then to marked differences in not just in the trends in inequality and wealth, but even in returns to wealth itself. So even when households hold the same type of assets, how markedly different the returns are that they get from owning these households. So the kind of the summary is that the recent period of institutional or systemic change has been deeply intertwined with that intersectional dimension of inequality. And here, just to give some previous findings here on these two crises and its asymmetric impact. The asymmetric impact of the crises, both the Great Recession and the current COVID crisis, has been quite well documented and is being documented as we speak, with particularly worse outcomes for women of color in the US, but also in other contexts. For example, in the UK, we observe that to some extent as well. This is where I'm based. And this, this really is the key, the key motivation behind what I was interested in terms of this paper. So this is certainly work in progress. My intention is to really examine how we can understand the the differences in wealth and their given their great importance, as has been already discussed in the panel today, specifically looking at not just wealth as an aggregate, but really understanding the composition of wealth and the implications for financial stability of a household. How can we start making sense of that at the intersectional dimension level? However, surprisingly, or perhaps unsurprisingly, scholarship on that particular topic has been somewhat limited by deficiencies in data, particularly over time. So I am not claiming that there is shortage of research in this area, absolutely not. It's just that when it comes to a more kind of broad overviews, again, as a macroeconomist, there is more that we need to know about the evolution of wealth inequality over time across, against the background of these recent institutional or systemic changes. And what we observe still is that in terms of the wealth inequality analysis, unlike the income inequality studies, there is still a lot of consensus that should be made or could be made that has not yet been made, which is perhaps we can have some discussions in the Q&A as to what the different measures tell us, what is the state of knowledge at the moment. But from my point of view, I was astonished to find that there is quite a limited evidence due to these data deficiencies when we look more specifically at the intersection of gender and race, especially over time. Of course, as I mentioned, it does not mean that there is shortage of research. There is indeed very rich intersectional inequality literature that talks about the different dimensions of inequality and how it relates, how these different dimensions relate to each other. And stratification economics literature, which has already been mentioned today and in the ASE panels more broadly, has really extended this idea of multidimensional intersectional inequality and how it is crucial for understanding this this worrying trends that we are observing in social injustice in recent years and decades. And just a very clear example that illustrates, although I don't not necessarily think that our panelists need introduction to these issues, is that there is evidence that even when we control for certain characteristics that are typically seen in the more say mainstream or orthodox literature that are associated with wealth accumulation or income as well, but in this case, wealth accumulation, there are these differences that are not explained by, for example, having a college degree or family structure that then expose that profound role of racial group stratification that often gets missed in the conventional studies of wealth inequality and wealth gaps. And there is a growing evidence in terms of specifically the intersection of gender and race, again with most evidence for the US, that depending on context, the dimensions of inequality, of discrimination, will interact with each other in a unique way or in unique ways. For instance, for earnings, Marlene Kim finds that there is a somewhat of a double penalty in terms of earnings of being a Black woman or a Latina woman again, in the US context. That would suggest that the gender discrimination and the racial discrimination are cumulative relative to each other, resulting in a kind of extra gap in earnings that cannot be otherwise estimated without taking that intersectionality dimension into account. A counterfactual example, can be thought of where the dimension of discriminations and at the intersection of gender and race are counteracting each other. And that can be perhaps due to affirmative action measures. So if we imagine that, someone, a Black woman or a Latina woman are somewhat benefiting from a program that leads to a kind of this not cumulative by counteracting relationship between the gender and the racial discrimination that they experience. And most recent research has found, again, at the intersection of gender and race, that in some contexts, actually, the stratification among these dimensions is not linear. It's actually hierarchical. And again, this has been mentioned already in the panel, meaning that there is certain ordering of the financial well-being, and in certain contexts, the racial disparities overwhelm what is experienced in terms of gender disparities. However, when we look at, especially from my knowledge of the literature on gender gaps, that the issue of race often gets underplayed, or at least it's not taking center stage, as I believe this research shows. So based on these, this more specific background of the literature, my goal is to look at the extent of wealth inequality across gender and race, specifically, looking at how it has changed over time against these structural changes, systemic changes that I have discussed at the beginning. I would also like to identify some key contributing factors. And I would also like to at least attempt to examine whether, when we look at wealth accumulation, do we also observe to some extent this double penalty for women of color? And as I mentioned, there is existing evidence on earnings. So my intention is to see, can I find something similar or not for the accumulation of wealth? And the way I decided to approach it is to use the rich data set that is the US Survey of Consumer Finances from 1999 to the most recent wave in 2019. Again, I expect that many of you are very familiar with this data set, but just for the sake of completeness, I will mention a few details. So this is household level data. So it is not individual data, it is household level data. And it presents some opportunities, but also some serious caveats that need to be kept in mind. Firstly, the great opportunity of this data is that it provides a very detailed information on asset and debt ownership, and to some extent some attitudinal variables as well, over a relatively long period of time. For this type of data set, compared to especially what we have for different countries, where actually this type of data often does not exist at all, or is available for maybe 1 or 2 waves. So this is the richness of the data set is the first opportunity. The other benefit of using this data is that it oversamples the top end of the distribution to account for non-response, which is quite common at the top end of in terms of household survey data. And it allows therefore for a more accurate estimation of wealth and wealth disparities compared to some other data set that do not do that. For example, the PSID, the panel study of income dynamics, as far as I know, it does not oversample the top. However, with that, these benefits require some choices to be made, and the first kind of trade-off is that when using this type of household level data, there is no information on intra or within household wealth distribution. And a common practice in this type of research is to then focus on single households in order to analyze gender disparities specifically. And in just, if we have time in the Q&A, I'm happy to say why this is a problem, especially with the US survey of consumer finances. So the analysis that will be shown subsequently is narrowed down to single households.
You have about a minute left.
This is also, yes, okay, I'm gonna move on to the overview of the results because I knew that I will run out of time. So I am again happy to show more the details of the method and the findings in the Q&A. So what I found using at this stage largely descriptive analysis is evidence of greater absolute inequalities across race than across gender. Meaning that the differences in wealth are materially greater across race, both for female and for male households, than across gender within each racial group. However, gender disparities are found to be fairly substantial. Again, not as high in absolute terms, but substantial among Black and Latinx households, especially compared to white households and other ethnicity households, which include Asian Americans, Native Islanders, and other ethnicities. And surprisingly or unsurprisingly, these disparities are somewhat rising during the subprime era for both groups. So the gender disparities among Black and among Latinx households, and also since 2013 until 2019 for Black households. Racial inequality across both genders remains high. How it did decline overall between 1989 and 2019. However, the subprime period was associated with rising wealth disparities in terms of the kind of transformed measure of net wealth. Again, I can talk in more detail in the Q&A. Specifically between white and Black households, both female and male, as well as female, white, and Latina households. Importantly, the period of the Great Recession was associated with increasing wealth inequality across white and Black households and white and Latinx households. And wealth inequality between male, white, and other ethnicity households, again, increased somewhat compared to a general decline for other. And based on the descriptive analysis, again, the caveat, it is not yet a full-blown formal regression analysis that I'm presenting here. I've started doing that, but it's it's been a challenge. So I decided to discuss more here the descriptive findings and some of the possible correlates of these disparities that I have just discussed relates mainly to inequalities in access to family wealth transfers. So again, that links very neatly with the previous presentation. Family wealth transfers being inheritance or asset gifts and the like. Another very major factor that is likely to play a role are differences in homeownership, in the ownership of primary residence across white and Black and Latinx households, and greater accumulation of unsecured debt among these households that leads to higher leverage, i.e. higher financial fragility for Black and Latinx households, especially female households. And surprisingly, at this stage, again, a caveat, it is a descriptive analysis, but some of the preliminary findings that I found for the conditional analysis in terms of the method that is commonly used in terms of the Oaxaca blinder decomposition and the recentered influence function decomposition, the factors that are often named in the literature as causes of wealth inequality, i.e. Earnings, educational attainment, even age to some extent, seem to play a smaller role compared to the variables relating to access and the composition of wealth. The final point I want to make, and again, I skipped quite a lot, so I'm happy to go into detail in any of the points that I've raised, is that there are major differences in the composition of the sample in terms of marital status, and they are likely to play a role as well. However, with this type of data, there is again a further trade-off, as I think again has already been highlighted in another presentation today, that there is a limitation in terms of the number of observations that you get when you start to dig deep into the dimensions. Say, if we now look at gender, by race, by marital status, there is some issue of kind of noise and data reliability that I have encountered. So I think that probably I'm out of time. So I apologize for not being able to get through all of it, but I do hope that you have found some of the insights interesting, and I hope to stay in touch with you to communicate the results further. Thank you very much.
Yes, and unfortunately that was the full 22 minutes allotted for your portion. So we'll just open up for Q&A for the panelists and to ask questions for any of the panelists whose work was presented today. If you could submit your questions to the Q&A, we have 5 minutes left, or about 4 to 5 minutes left. So submit your questions to the Q&A. And if any panelists have any comments for any of the panelists, please feel free to comment as well. So someone might have a comment for Hanna immediately, since her presentation was so fresh.
I'll note right away, Hanna, that what an interesting topic and what a nice job sort of pulling together lots of different pieces of information for us. I am really interested in your final analysis of the different mechanisms of the transmission of wealth inequality, because it feels like a few scholars have just been beating us as a profession into thinking about this more, and unfortunately we just have so much more that we need to know. So I look forward to seeing where you go with that.
Thank you. And just as a very brief follow-up, it has been a challenge to use this data, and perhaps that's why not many people have looked at it before with this particular set of data set. But I think that, just because it's difficult, I think as long as we're honest what we are actually looking at, what the caveats let us look at, it is worthwhile. So thank you for your comment.
So Hanna, I think that one of the more intriguing parts of your paper has to do with the intersectionality. I think if you expand it the Crenshaw notion of intersectionality, as well as some of the mathematical questions of whether or not the separate effects of race and gender exceed or smaller than the combined effects of race and gender. So I think your data set and your analysis is actually ripe for an explicit test of the intersectionality hypothesis. And I think you should spend a little time trying to explain exactly what within the idea of home ownership and foreclosure and mortgage lending, what constitute an empirical representation of the notion of intersectionality. And that's where I think the paper has a really different type of contribution than the other types of papers that historically have been looking at the effects of the recession on racial disparities and wealth and home ownership. And I did put into the question box a paper that I hope that you'll cite that deals with exactly kind of the conventional idea of what were the determinants of the racial disparities and wealth during the recession.
Okay, and we have received the 1 minute warning that the session will end. So, and I think the sessions just end automatically. But if you have any responses to that, Hanna, you can feel free to do so.
I just wanted to thank you. Appreciate it. And I will certainly look into that. Thank you very much.
Okay. All right. Anyone have any last comments to take us out? If not, thank you everyone for presenting your very interesting papers.